Well, good morning, and you'll see from my dress that global warming obviously is not happening across here in Northern Ireland at the moment. It's absolutely freezing. Today I want to talk about Boris. And before Boris was elected in 2019, I made a speech outside the BBC in London. And I warned the people not to put their trust in Boris Johnson. I warned them of his track record of lying and his problems with the truth and with telling the truth. And well, of course, everybody listened to me and we got Boris as Prime Minister. But there was no other option. The reality is, in 2019, the only way to get Brexit done was to get Boris in. However, the Boris Johnson that we thought we got is not the Boris Johnson that's living in Downing Street. Boris Johnson is now wedded to an absolutely fanatical, progressive, liberal Carrie Antoinette, as I like to call her. You know, you can just imagine her saying to Boris about, Granny dying of hypothermia because the price of gas and fuel have gone up by 300% in the last 3 years. This is me projecting into the future. And grannies and granddads are dying in their droves because they can't afford to heat their houses. They can't take their little Fiat Punto to the shops anymore because petrol has gone up to £15 a litre. And all of them have been told that they must go out and spend whatever savings they've got on electric cars and preparing to have people come into their houses, clean them up and wash them down. So you can just imagine Carrie Antoinette sitting there with Boris and saying to Boris, "But Boris, why can't they eat carrot cake? Why can't they just live like us, these peasants? Because this is what's happening." Boris put on the robes of a populist, but he was no populist. Boris was no UKIP councillor. Boris is part of the establishment, part of the political elite, groomed for power. And that's what we've got. But Boris has overstepped the mark. And Boris Johnson has to go. And I'm not talking about the sleaze scandal. There's always going to be political sleaze, whatever party you have in power. You want to talk about political sleaze, look at Gordon Brown and look at the little PR campaign that Gordon Brown has been running for China. Look at the Tony Blair Foundation and how much Mr. Blair earns from running around the world as a former Prime Minister who launched us into a disastrous war in Iraq, and how much money he earns for his trouble of acting on behalf of our overlords in Saudi Arabia and our overlords as they were in the United States. But that's another story. The reality is there's always been political sleaze, and there always will be political sleaze. But Boris's crimes are far more fundamental than the sleaze that we're hearing about in Parliament. Politicians, by the very nature of politics, will always be subject to the temptation of acting on behalf of interests that either give them money or persuade them to act on their behalf. What are Boris's crimes? Well, I think Boris has committed 3 heinous crimes since he's been in power. The first crime that Boris has committed is the crime of climate panic. Climate change panic. Boris seems to be obsessed with 1.5 degrees. Boris seems to be obsessed with this mythological net zero. And I'm not sure exactly what's happening with this. I mean, I'm not an expert in these things, but it seems to me, from what I can gather, that the United Kingdom, Great Britain and Northern Ireland, can be completely self-sufficient in non-coal fossil fuels. And there are oil and gas reserves. I think there's something like 850 million barrels Again, I stand corrected if I'm wrong on this, but I think there's about 850 million barrels of oil buried just north of Shetland. Of course, when you get oil, you get gas. So the United Kingdom can be self-sufficient in oil and gas. And then, of course, there's the whole idea of fracking, which is completely beyond the pale for environmentalists. But the problem is that Boris might as well be the leader of the Green Party. In fact, Boris might as well be the leader of Greenpeace or Insulate Britain, because the panicky speech that he gave at the so-called COP, was it COP26? Wasn't it COP26 meeting in Glasgow? His panicky speech where he channeled his inner James Bond. I don't think there's any real resemblance between Bond and Boris. I mean, Boris is probably more like Blofeld from the 1970s than he is like James Bond. But anyway, the panic that he engendered, telling everyone we're a minute to midnight, was absolutely ridiculous. And the reality is that there are very real world consequences for his decision to throw the United Kingdom lemming-like off the cliff of net zero. And those consequences will be that businesses can no longer compete with China, with India, with America, because America ain't going to do it. I mean, the reality is, once Biden's gone, America will be back to business as usual. They'll be burning fossil fuels like there's no tomorrow. But of course, the thing about America is, America, by using their gas reserves and using their oil reserves and not using coal, cut their carbon footprint, I think it was by 10 or 20% in a very, very short space of time. But no, Boris has decided that windmills, wind farms, solar panels, I mean, we live in the United Kingdom, for goodness sake. We're not living in Saudi Arabia or sub-Saharan Africa. We don't get enough sun for solar panels to keep the lights on right the way through winter. This is completely preposterous, and obviously solar panels don't work for 8 hours a day, or however long we lose daylight on average. And when the wind doesn't blow, which in the summer it doesn't, the turbines go off. We know all this. The reality is that Boris should be, if he wants to cut the UK's carbon footprint, should be investing heavily in those gas and oil reserves that we've got. They should be getting them out of ground and burning gas and oil and keeping us self-sufficient in cheap electricity, so that we can have a prosperous economy and so that we can have a truly global Britain. Because what's the point in having Brexit if our economy is totally trashed? They've already destroyed the economy by the lockdowns that they did during the pandemic. And I believe those lockdowns were totally unnecessary. But the climate change panic that Boris has got himself worked up into, his hysteria. I mean, Boris was, and Prince Charles and the rest of those hypocrites, because they were all running around in private jets and limousines. Those hypocrites in Glasgow, the panic that they were pushing into people's psyche, people that don't go and look at what's really happening, was just off the chart. So that's the first one. Boris's massive miscalculation when it comes to climate change and what he's going to do to the British economy probably for the next 20 or 30 years, unless somebody gets a grip of him or unless he goes. So that's his first crime. His second crime, well, of course, his second crime, he's always shunting it down the road and blaming it on Priti Patel. We're being invaded. Our country has been invaded, not just across the English Channel. I have a friend lives in the east of England. He says they're coming in right the way around the Norfolk Broads. There are tens of thousands of people illegally coming into our country. So what that means is when the media calls these people migrants and economic migrants or refugees or asylum seekers, I wish they would frame it properly. These people are criminals. The people that are coming across the channel are criminals. They're involved in a criminal conspiracy to break into my country and your country. That's what they are. They are criminals. I don't care what religious background they come from. I don't care what colour their skin is or what their skin pigmentation is. Plain and simple. If you break a country's law, you're a criminal in that country. And they're committing a crime. And now we have the RNLI, we have Border Force, we have the police collaborating in this crime. Turning a blind eye to this crime. And even facilitating this crime. It's illegal to come into a country without permission, without papers, without documents, without a passport. It's against the law. So these people aren't migrants. Let's just call them what they are, they're criminals. But Boris has done nothing about it. Priti Patel has done nothing about it. And they blame the Home Office. And believe you me, I mean, I've spoken to people who have intimate knowledge of how the Home Office works. And according to those people, the Home Office is a literal nest of vipers. Left-wing activists masquerading as civil servants. And not only that, one person told me, well, he's told me on several occasions, that the Home Office is infested with Islamists as well. And a certain Home Office minister that I think was appointed several years ago made sure that the demographic of the Home Office was heavily loaded in the direction of Islamism. So, yes, there are problems in the Home Office. Yes, there's problems with Border Force. Yes, there's problems with European courts. But if a government has a will, think about this. This government managed to lock down the entire population of the United Kingdom for a year and then fund it. They found the money from somewhere. They locked us all away and they funded us to protect the NHS. No doubt they'll try and do it again. But Boris and Priti can't get a handle on a few people coming across the English Channel. Well, of course, it's not a few people anymore. If it keeps going like it's going to be into the hundreds of thousands by the time we're finished with all this. Of young fighting age men from cultures and societies that do not respect women, that do not respect law and order, breaking into our country illegally. Boris, you are betraying your people. You are betraying your country. You need to get a grip. And finally, and possibly the biggest betrayal of all, and the biggest crime of Boris Johnson. And these three crimes should see Boris removed from office. These three crimes that Boris Johnson has committed should see that man removed from office as soon as possible. The final crime is the breaking of the union. Northern Ireland, the country that provided soldiers by the thousand during the First and Second World War. The country that stood against the most vile, disgusting terrorist organisation that Western Europe has ever seen, the Provisional IRA. The country that paid a massive price during the Blitz in the Second World War has been sold for 30 pieces of silver to the European Union so that Boris could have his oven-ready microwave meal deal done with the European Union. And it was just a mess of pottage. He sold Northern Ireland out. Maybe he didn't read the small print. Well, if he didn't, that's his fault. And this nonsense about negotiations with the European Union, you can't negotiate with the devil. They're not our friends and allies, they're our enemies. They are the enemies of democracy, they're the enemies of the United Kingdom. I'm not talking about the people of the European Union, I'm talking about the institution and the institutions of the European Union that want to control and bully. Like any bully, it's all about control, it's all about manipulation. And if you've ever been in a situation where someone has been trying to control you and manipulate you, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Maybe it's a manipulative boss or somebody in a manipulative relationship. But that's what the European Union is. They're still trying to control the United Kingdom. And Boris and this supposed bulldog Lord Frost are rolling over and letting the savage Rottweiler tickle the tummy of the poodle that the United Kingdom has become under this so-called Conservative government. But they're not a Conservative government. I call them the Conservative and Communist Party. So Boris has to go. The question is, who replaces him? And my big fear is that if Boris goes, we will not get a true Conservative leading the Conservative Party. We'll either get Gove, maybe Rishi Sunak. Maybe Rishi would be the best of a bad bunch. And my goodness, the ever more authoritarian Sajid Javid will no doubt be in those shark-infested waters, looking to get his chance to have a bite at being Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And we look at the way he's behaving at the minute as Health Secretary, he's becoming more and more authoritarian. But Boris must go, there's no doubt about that. And the reality is that, like UKIP put massive pressure on the Conservative Party and forced the Conservative Party to hold the Brexit referendum, then the fragmented parties that there are out there, and I'm thinking about For Britain, the Reform Party, is that Lawrence Fox's one? There's that many now, you kind of forget the names. Whatever's left of UKIP, they must form some sort of coalition, the SDP, they must form some sort of coalition of small parties who believe in liberty, believe in freedom, and are patriotic Brits, and I think that's the key to all this. And they must stand against the Conservative Party and against the Labour Party and decimate them in any upcoming elections. And I know it's going to be almost impossible, sadly, for any of those parties to maybe even get a seat in Parliament. But if they can create enough havoc among the established parties and take votes off the Labour Party, take votes off the Lib Dems and take votes off the Conservative Party and damage those parties at their core, that will scare those parties, and those parties will have to change, and they'll have to start doing what we want, which is protecting our country, protecting the freedom, and I always talk about this, the freedom of our country, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly. This government's trying to do away with all of those things. It really is. And genuine equality, not this critical race nonsense, not this BLM nonsense, not the sort of poison that men like Kahindi Andrews, and thank goodness we don't see him much on the TV anymore. Maybe he's having a rest. But this nonsense that these people that talk about the psychosis of whiteness, can you imagine if somebody said that about black people or Asian people? We've got to turn the world on its head. And in doing it, we've got to turn it back the right way up. Proper equality, not this nonsense that you get from these racist groups like Black Lives Matter. The very name is racist. That's what we need to do. Boris needs to be put to the sword, metaphorically. And we need to hold the Conservative Party to account. There's so many problems facing our nation I haven't even got into, but those three are crimes that can be absolutely pinned on Boris's chest. The climate change fiasco, the net zero catastrophe, because it will be a catastrophe for the country, the immigration catastrophe, because it is going to be a catastrophe for the country unless somebody gets a grip of it. You know, I firmly believe there is a mafia running up and down the spine of this country, predominantly Pakistani Muslim, that's involved in drug dealing, people trafficking, grooming and rape and trafficking of young children, young girls predominantly, heroin dealing, and they have tentacles everywhere. They have tentacles in the legal profession. They have tentacles reaching into the police and social services. I genuinely believe that. And again, that's another monster that needs to be faced down and needs to be challenged. So there's so many problems facing our country right now. It's a very grim picture. But the first step in getting things right is getting rid of Boris. Boris Johnson must go, and hopefully we'll start to see the clock turn back to a time when Britain was a cohesive, peaceful and settled state, because I believe we are storing up absolute chaos and disaster for future generations with all these policies, the climate change, with immigration, and with the fracturing of the United Kingdom by these crazy policies that Boris has pushed upon us. Anyway, Bojo has to go. Let that be the tagline. Bojo has to go. Long video, quite a lot of talk in there, but yeah, like and share it. Let me know what you think. Give us some comments down below, and I'll see you all soon. Maybe when it's a little bit warmer.